I was ironing my dress shirt when my phone buzzed on the bathroom counter. I almost ignored it. I had exactly 40 minutes before I needed to leave for the church, and the last thing I wanted was another distraction. But something made me glance down at the screen. It was a text from a number I didn't recognize. "Mr. Aldridge, this is Paul Heston from Heston and Associates. I need to speak with you urgently before this afternoon. Please call me back." I stood there holding the iron, steam rising around my hand, reading that message 3 times. I didn't know any Paul Heston. I didn't know any Heston and Associates. And I had no idea why a lawyer I'd never heard of needed to speak with me urgently on the morning of my son's wedding. I almost dismissed it. Probably a wrong number, I told myself. Some mix-up. I had a rehearsal dinner to get to the night before, and today I had a wedding to attend. My son Ethan was getting married at 2 o'clock, and I was his best man. Not just his father, his best man. He'd asked me himself, standing in my kitchen 6 months ago with that grin of his, the one that looked exactly like his mother's. I set the iron down and called the number back. Paul Heston answered on the second ring. His voice was calm and measured, the way lawyers talk when they're delivering news they know will gut you. "Mr. Aldridge, thank you for calling. I'm sorry to contact you under these circumstances and on a day like today, but I represent First Meridian Bank's legal division, and we've flagged some activity on accounts registered to your Social Security number that we believe requires your immediate attention." I sat down on the edge of the bathtub. "What kind of activity?" I asked. "Sir, over the past 14 months, there have been a series of wire transfers totaling approximately $230,000. The transfers originated from your joint savings account and your home equity line of credit. Based on the authorization signatures on file, it appears someone has been acting on your behalf. But several of those signatures have been flagged by our fraud team as potentially inconsistent with your verified signature on record." I heard the words. I understood each one individually, but they didn't add up to anything that made sense to me. "I'm sorry," I said. $230,000? "Yes, sir. I know this is a great deal to absorb. I wouldn't be calling on a Saturday morning if I didn't believe it was time sensitive. The account has been essentially drained. We froze activity this morning once our fraud department escalated the flag. But I wanted to speak with you directly before taking further steps." I asked him if he could hold on for a moment. I set the phone down on the counter and looked at myself in the mirror. The man looking back at me was 61 years old, wearing a half-ironed white dress shirt with an expression I didn't recognize on his face. $230,000. That was the money I'd been building for 30 years. The account Sandra and I had opened together when we were both 32. Saving $20 a week at first, then 50, then more as the years went on. It was the money I'd planned to use when I retired from the post office next year, the money that was supposed to let me breathe for the first time in my adult life. I picked the phone back up. "Mr. Heston," I said. "Who authorized those transfers?" There was a brief pause. "Sir, the authorization documents list a secondary account holder. A joint access was added approximately 18 months ago. The name on the authorization is Ethan Aldridge." The room went quiet. Not silent, the way a room goes silent when you turn off the television. Quiet, the way a room goes quiet when something fundamental has broken. Like the air itself is holding its breath. Ethan, my son, the one getting married in 4 hours. I don't remember exactly how I ended the call with Paul Heston. I remember agreeing to meet him at his office Monday morning. I remember him saying something about contacting the fraud division of the OCC and about preserving documentation. I remember saying yes and okay and I understand. What I remember most clearly is sitting on that bathroom floor afterward, still holding my phone, still in my half-ironed shirt, trying to think straight. Let me back up. Because you need to understand who Ethan is, or who I thought he was, before any of this makes sense. Ethan is my only child. His mother, Sandra, passed away from ovarian cancer 9 years ago. He was 26 when she died, and I was 52. We'd been a family of 3 in a 4-bedroom house in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And after she was gone, it was just the 2 of us rattling around in that house for a while, figuring out how to be a family of 2. Those were hard years. But Ethan was good to me during them. He checked in. He came home for holidays. He called every Sunday. He had a decent job as an assistant operations manager at a shipping logistics company in Houston. He met a woman named Jillian about 3 years ago. Sharp, kind, good family, and proposed to her last spring. About 18 months ago, he came back to Baton Rouge for a weekend visit. We had dinner at the kitchen table the way we always did. Somewhere between the pot roast and the pecan pie, he said he needed a favor. "Dad, I'm getting some of my financial planning organized," he said. "I talked to a guy at my firm about estate planning, just getting things in order. He said the simplest thing, in case anything ever happened to you, would be to make sure I'm listed on your accounts, just so there's no delay if anything came up." It didn't sound alarming when he said it. It sounded like something a responsible adult's son would do. He put a document in front of me. I remember it looked official, printed on thick paper, and he explained it was just a standard joint access authorization. He was talking while I was reaching for a pen, and I'll be honest, I skimmed it. I trusted him. He was my son. I signed it. What I didn't know, what I didn't bother to find out, and what I will never forgive myself for, was that the document I signed gave him authorization to transfer funds without my knowledge or approval, and that over the next 14 months. That's exactly what he did. I found all of this out slowly over that weekend, piece by piece, call by call, sitting in my kitchen with a yellow legal pad and a growing sense of nausea. I called my own bank. Not First Meridian, but the local credit union where I kept my checking account, and asked them to walk me through recent transactions. Nothing unusual there. Then I called First Meridian directly and asked for a complete statement history on my savings and home equity accounts going back 2 years. I'm not going to list every single transfer, but I will tell you this: they were structured carefully, almost never more than $9,000 at a time, spread out over 14 months, varying intervals, different payee names. Some were LLCs I'd never heard of. One was something called Aldridge Property Management, LLC, which did not exist. Someone had put thought into this. Someone who knew exactly what they were doing. That night I didn't sleep. I lay in the dark in the house I'd owned for 23 years. The house where Ethan grew up, where Sandra cooked Christmas dinner, where I paid down every penny of the mortgage. And I tried to understand how I had failed to see this coming. Sunday morning I called my old friend Dennis. We'd worked together at the post office for 20 years before he retired, and his daughter-in-law happened to be a forensic accountant. He gave me her number without asking too many questions. I called her and explained what I knew. She told me to get every document I could lay hands on before Monday and to not contact Ethan. "Don't tip him off," she said. "Don't confront him yet. If he suspects you know, documents disappear." I spent Sunday pulling paper. Old bank statements I'd kept in a box in the closet. The authorization document from that dinner 18 months ago. I photographed everything with my phone. I emailed copies to Paul Heston at First Meridian and to Dennis's daughter-in-law. The whole time, my phone was lighting up with messages about the wedding. "Can't wait for tomorrow, Dad. Ceremony starts at 2. Don't be late, old man. Shh. Jillian's nervous. But I told her you'd make her feel like family right away. I read every message. I didn't respond to most of them. When I did, I kept it short. Fine. See you tomorrow. Glad to be there. I want you to understand something about that Sunday. People ask me later, after all of this came out, why didn't you just call him and confront him right then? Why sit on it? Why go to that wedding? And I understand why people ask that. I asked myself the same thing 100 times that day. Here's what I kept coming back to. I needed to be sure. Not 90% sure. Completely sure. Because Ethan was my son. Because if there was some explanation, some mistake, some misunderstanding I wasn't seeing, I would never forgive myself for blowing up his wedding over it. And because if there was no mistake, if this was exactly what it looked like, then I needed to be ready. I needed documentation, legal counsel, and a clear head, not a scene in a church parking lot. So I went to the wedding. I wore the dress shirt I'd ironed on Saturday morning. I drove myself to Holy Trinity Church on Magazine Street. I sat in the front pew and I shook hands with people I'd known for years. I smiled when Jillian's mother told me how handsome I looked. I laughed at something the pastor said before the ceremony began, and I watched my son walk up the aisle in a charcoal gray suit, looking confident and handsome and relaxed, and I thought about the $230,000. The ceremony was beautiful in the way weddings are beautiful. I cried at one point. Not because I was happy, though part of me was, God help me. I cried because I kept thinking about Sandra. I kept thinking about how much she would have wanted to be there. And I kept thinking about what she would have said if she'd known what her son had done. The reception was at a rooftop venue on the river. Open bar, a live jazz trio, the kind of catered food that costs a fortune and gets eaten in 10 minutes. I made my way through it as best I could. I hugged Jillian and told her she was beautiful. I shook hands with her father. I accepted a glass of champagne I barely touched. Then Ethan tapped his glass. The room quieted down. He stood up, and his new wife was beside him, and he had the look of a man who was exactly where he wanted to be. He thanked everyone for coming. He thanked Jillian's parents. He talked about how lucky he was to have found someone like her. And then he turned toward where I was sitting, and he said, I have to take a minute to talk about my dad. I went very still. A lot of people here know that I lost my mom 9 years ago, he said, and that wasn't easy for anyone. But my dad, he paused, composed himself a little. My dad held everything together. He worked 30 years at the post office so I could go to college. He showed me what it means to be a man of integrity. Everything I know about loyalty and doing right by the people you love, I learned from watching him. People applauded. Someone at the next table over said, "Aw." Jillian reached up and squeezed Ethan's hand. I sat there and I did not move. Integrity. He used the word integrity. The man who had been quietly wiring my retirement savings to shell companies for 14 months stood in front of a room full of people and talked about integrity. I smiled. I raised my glass. I nodded when people looked at me with warm expressions. I left the reception at 8:30 before the cake was cut. I told Ethan I was tired and that I'd call him in the morning. He hugged me and said he loved me. I hugged him back. In my car, driving home across the I-10 bridge, I called Paul Heston and left a voicemail. I told him I was ready to proceed. I told him to go ahead and contact whoever needed to be contacted. I told him I would be at his office at 9 a.m. Monday. Then I pulled into a gas station on the other side of the bridge and sat there for a long time. I wasn't angry exactly. I'd passed through anger sometime around 3 in the morning on Saturday. What I felt sitting in that gas station parking lot was something flatter and harder than anger, something that had edges to it. Over the next 6 weeks, here is what happened. Paul Heston connected me with an attorney named Charles Beaumont who specialized in elder financial fraud. Charles was maybe 45, methodical, not given to drama. Exactly the kind of person you want in your corner when everything feels like it's on fire. He reviewed the authorization document I had signed and confirmed what I already suspected. The language was deliberately vague. Ethan hadn't forged my signature. He had gotten me to sign a document I didn't fully read, then used it as authorization to do things the document technically covered, but that I had never intended to allow. The good news, Charles told me, is that fraudulent inducement is still fraud. He misrepresented what you were signing. The state's attorney's office got involved. There was a lot of documentation, a lot of phone calls, a lot of waiting. Dennis's daughter-in-law traced the money. Most of it had gone into accounts Ethan controlled through 2 LLCs he'd set up in Delaware. Some of it he'd spent. A down payment on a condo in Houston that was now in both his and Jillian's name. Some expensive furniture, a truck. Some of it, about $60,000, was still sitting in one of the LLC accounts when the fraud examiner got to it. I felt terrible about Jillian. I did. She was not part of this. Charles's investigation made that clear. When she found out 2 weeks after the wedding, she apparently confronted Ethan in their new kitchen and he admitted everything. She called me herself that evening, and she was crying so hard I could barely understand her. "Mr. Bott, Aldridge," she kept saying. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I swear to you I didn't know." I believed her. I told her so. Ethan was arrested 5 weeks after the wedding on 2 counts of financial elder abuse and 1 count of financial elder abuse and 1 count of wire fraud. He made bail. He got a lawyer. I don't know everything that happened between him and Jillian after that, but from what I've heard, she filed for annulment. The criminal case is still moving through the system as of the time I'm telling you this. These things take time. Charles tells me we also have a strong civil case, and that between the frozen LLC assets and the condo, which will likely need to be liquidated, I'll recover a significant portion of what was taken. Not all of it. Probably not all of it. But here's what I want you to understand. And this is the part that I think matters most, more than the money, more than the charges, more than any of it. When I signed that paper at my kitchen table 18 months ago, I wasn't naive. I wasn't losing my mind. I was a man who trusted his son, and that's not stupidity. That's not weakness. That's what a father is supposed to do. The failure wasn't mine. I need to say that out loud because for a long time I couldn't. I spent weeks convinced that I had let Sandra down somehow, that I had raised someone capable of this and hadn't seen it coming. That there was some version of me who should have known. But here's the truth. I was a good father. I worked hard, I showed up, I told him who I was and what I believed in every single day for 30 years. What he did with that is on him, not on me. I'm still in the house on Baton Rouge. I'm still going to retire from the post office next spring, though it'll look a little different than I planned. My neighbor Peggy brought me a casserole 3 days after the arrest was in the paper, and we ended up sitting on my porch until almost 10 at night just talking, the way I hadn't talked to anyone in a long time. That was something. I still think about that speech at the wedding, the one about integrity, about doing right by the people you love. I've thought about it enough now that the anger has mostly quieted down, and what's left is something I can only describe as sad. Not for myself, really. For him. Because somewhere between watching his mother die and turning into whoever he became, my son lost the thread. And he stood up in front of everyone who loved him, and he talked about things he no longer had any real connection to, and I don't think he even knew that. I think he believed it. I think on some level he convinced himself the words were true, even as he was living the opposite. That might be the saddest part of all of this. Sandra used to say that the hardest thing about loving someone is that you can't make choices for them. You can model everything. You can be there every time they need you, and then they become who they become, and that's out of your hands. She was right about a lot of things. I still talk to her sometimes. Not in a strange way, just late at night when the house is quiet. The way you talk to someone whose voice you miss. I told her about all of this eventually. I told her what happened and what I did and how it turned out. I'd like to think she'd approve of how I handled it. The patience, the documentation, the decision to let the law do what the law is supposed to do instead of blowing everything up in a church parking lot. I'd like to think she'd be proud of me for that. I'm working on being proud of myself. There's something nobody tells you about being betrayed by your own child. People talk about it like it's a wound you recover from, like eventually you find the lesson and move on. And maybe that's true. But for a long time, the hardest part wasn't the money. It was the question I kept turning over in the dark. Where did I go wrong? I think that question is the cruelest thing betrayal does to a decent person. It takes the guilt that belongs to someone else and drops it on your shoulders, and if you're not careful, you carry it like it's yours. I carried it for a while. I won't pretend I didn't. But here's what I eventually came to understand, and it took longer than I'd like to admit. Actions have weight. Every single one of them. Not in some abstract philosophical way, in a real, practical cause and effect way that plays out in real time in real life. Ethan made a series of choices. He chose to misrepresent that document. He chose to wire out $9,000 at a time, carefully, methodically, for 14 months. He chose to stand at a wedding reception and give a speech about integrity while those transfers were sitting in a Delaware LLC with his name on it. Nobody made those choices for him. Not me, not Sandra's memory, not his childhood, not anything. Him. And because those choices were real, the consequences were real. That's not punishment handed down from somewhere above. That's just how a life works. You build who you are one decision at a time, and eventually you are what you've built. Ethan built something rotten beneath a very convincing surface, and when it was finally exposed, there was nothing underneath to hold him up. What I had to learn, what I'm still learning, is that wisdom isn't the same as suspicion. I wasn't foolish to trust my son. Trust is not the enemy. The enemy is the assumption that love makes people immune to their own worst instincts. I loved Ethan completely, and that love did not protect either of us from who he chose to become. Recognizing that is not cynicism, it's just honesty. The thing about resilience. And I hate that word a little because it gets used so much it's lost its edges. But the real thing it describes is not bouncing back. It's deciding to keep going after something fundamental has broken. It's sitting in a gas station parking lot at 9 o'clock on a Saturday night after your son's wedding reception, knowing what you know, and still making the decision to handle it with your head instead of your hands. That's not easy. That's a choice you make against every instinct screaming at you to do otherwise. I made that choice. I'm proud of that. Not of everything, not of every moment, but of that. Paul Heston called me on a Saturday morning, and the world I thought I lived in turned out to be different than I believed. That's a hard thing. But I documented everything. I called the right people. I let the law do what the law exists to do. And I didn't blow up my daughter-in-law's life in the process because she didn't deserve it. You build your character the same way Ethan drained that account. One decision at a time, small ones, over a long stretch of time. The difference is what you're building toward. I'm 61 years old. I'm still going to retire next spring, and I'm going to be okay. Not because things turned out perfectly, but because I know who I am. That's mine. Nobody can wire that out of my account.